You're listening to Himalayan Adventure by Vaile. Chapter 44.
On the far side of the tarmac, the twin-propeller aircraft commandeered by the North Koreans was taxiing into position on the northern side of the runway, in readiness for takeoff. The North Korean pilot was hastily finishing a pre-flight check, assisted by a black-clad soldier whose only flying qualifications were that A, he was alive, and B, his injuries following the explosion of the previous plane did not prevent him from taking verbal instructions and operating the cockpit controls. The mission commander was standing at the back of the cockpit, yelling at them to get the plane in the air. Sweating under the pressure, the pilot finished checking off the remaining items on the pre-flight list. He was a skilled aviator, but his flying experience back in North Korea comprised mostly military aircraft, and he was not used to small commercial planes like this one. Nevertheless, you learn fast when a North Korean mission commander is breathing down your back. Satisfied that he could safely fly the plane and its precious cargo back to North Korea, the pilot placed his hand on the throttle and prepared to power up. Suddenly, the co-pilot pointed at something in the distance and exclaimed, "Look!" The pilot paused and stared in the direction that the co-pilot was pointing. Halfway down the runway, a dilapidated truck was racing straight towards the plane, bouncing across tarmac and grass and closing the gap fast. One unbroken headlight shone into the night at a crazy angle. "What the hell is that?" swore the mission commander, staring out the cockpit window. A truck plowing across the tarmac towards the plane could only be bad news. Turning back to the open doorway behind him, he yelled out for one of the soldiers in the plane to pass him some binoculars on the double. Binoculars were immediately placed in his waiting hands. Putting them to his face, he studied the approaching truck. The image revealed a dented truck with only a driver. A huge bear of a man with short silver hair and a jutting jaw, whom the commander immediately recognized as the commando named Flat Top. The one who was supposed to deliver a live yeti specimen to the North Korean assault force but had failed miserably. At the speed he was traveling, he would intercept the plane in less than 30 seconds. The squad leader appeared in the doorway. "What is it?" he asked. The commander passed him the binoculars. "Flat Top is on his way in," he replied. "He's alone," observed the squad leader. "What do you want us to do?" "Stop the plane," ordered the commander, "and let him in." "What?" the squad leader asked. "Our Grand Marshal instructed us to capture or kill the 3 GXs, explained the commander. The stress of even considering disobeying an instruction from the Grand Marshal caused the squad leader's blood pressure to go up 100 points. "Of course," he stammered, "but I don't trust Flat Top. He failed to deliver the yeti specimen, and I don't know what he's doing here now. It may be some kind of trap. Given the difficulties we've had tonight, I think we should take off now while we still can." "Silence," howled the commander. "We are bringing him in as ordered by the Grand Marshal. If you have a problem with that, you can get out of the plane when he gets in." "No, sir, no problem, sir," cried the squad leader, snapping a perfect parade ground salute. "That said," continued the commander, "I don't trust Flat Top either. Our orders are to capture or kill, so I can see no reason why we need to keep him alive. Bring him on board, then get rid of him at the first opportunity. I don't want to take any more risks in getting this cargo back home." Nodding in agreement and bowing low enough to check that the mission commander's black bootlaces were tied with a regulation 3-inch double bow, the squad leader backed away and ordered 2 soldiers to lower the door to the ground, then stand ready to assist Flat Top on board the aircraft. The truck shuddered to a halt on its noisy brakes about 10 meters from the stationary plane. Flat Top jumped out of the driver's side and immediately put his hands up to show that he was unarmed. 2 machine gun barrels pointed straight at him from the open doorway of the dimly lit aircraft interior. The plane looked really small from Flat Top's claustrophobic point of view. Beads of sweat broke out on his forehead and rolled down over his swollen eye. He blinked rapidly and took a deep breath. The guns didn't worry him, but the thought of having to step inside that narrow cylinder of steel made his heart feel like it was beating backwards. The squad leader stepped into view and waved him in. "Move it, soldier," he ordered sternly. "You know we're in the middle of a hot zone here." Flat Top ran across the remaining meters, then jumped up into the open doorway. The floor creaked under the unexpected weight of the enormous half-man, half-gorilla boarding the plane. He ducked his head low as he went through the door and stayed that way inside the plane. If he made the mistake of standing up to his full height, he would punch his whole head up into the ceiling. Flat Top towered over the handful of soldiers on the plane. They stopped what they were doing and stared at him, muttering to themselves in slack-jawed amazement. Even the pilot took his eyes off his instruments and did a quick rubberneck to get a glimpse of the new passenger. As the occupants of the plane examined Flat Top, he examined them. He counted 5 soldiers in the back and 3 in the cockpit, including the 2 pilots. Possibly the third man standing was the ranking officer. It was hard to tell when they were all wearing black. Glancing towards the back of the plane, he saw Sierra's body lying in the aisle, uncovered, his furry white feet facing forward. No attempt had been made to cover the body or show it any dignity in death. Pretty clearly it had been dumped unceremoniously on the floor in the soldiers' haste to get the heck out of town. Enemy soldier or not, that was no way for a person or a yeti to die. The aircraft's door closed behind Flat Top with a precise metallic clunk, like the sound of a bank vault being shut. He felt keenly aware that the aisle in which he was standing had not been designed with genetically engineered supersoldiers in mind. His head was too high, his shoulders too broad, and his arse too big to fit into one of the leather-covered seats. Somewhere on this plane, something was going to get broken if he moved around. Perhaps the squad leader had the same concern in mind. "Sit down, soldier," he snapped, pointing to a seat, "and buckle yourself in because we're taking off." Flat Top sat down and pretended to fumble with the seat belt. He noticed that the squad leader sat right behind him. The ranking officer, whom he was now pretty certain was the mission commander, closed and locked the cockpit door, then moved down the aisle and sat further back. Flat Top sat very still. In front of him were several empty seats and the closed door leading to the cockpit. Behind him were 6 armed adversaries. He couldn't see them, but he could hear them. Their breathing, their movement, the faintest rustle of the fabric of their clothes, or the sound of a hand touching a weapon. His hearing had always been superior to that of other soldiers. Following his conversation with Maine, he now knew that was the result of the inclusion of gorilla DNA in his genome and the genetic engineering process that created him. Suddenly there was a terrific vroom as the pilot opened the throttle and the twin propellers spun up to their maximum revolutions. Flat Top was pressed back in his seat as the plane accelerated down the runway. The giant GX closed his eyes, scented his mind, and gently placed one hand on the armrest, right on the small lever that, when pressed, would cause his seat to quickly recline. Sitting directly behind, the squad leader stared at the enormous bulk of the commando. His was not to question why, but he did briefly wonder how the heck this guy got so big. Why was his hair silver? And more importantly, why was he so funny-looking? One of his parents must have been an ape. The squad leader shook his head slightly. Some, he decided, were just born ugly. Gently he eased his handgun out of the synthetic holster in his black combat vest. Nice and slow, that's it. He looked down at the weapon's safety. Off, from memory, at least 6 rounds left. Good. The first one might not be enough to stop this big lug, but 6 would put him on the floor. Permanently. A headshot would be quicker, but it would make a terrible mess. And there was always the risk that the bullet would continue on its trajectory and puncture the aircraft's fuselage. The squad leader decided against it. Flat Top wasn't wearing a bulletproof vest, so the smart choice was to put several shots into his back. There was a high probability that his huge body would contain the shots and his clothes would contain the blood. Death would not be instantaneous, but who was going to quibble about a minute or two either way? With the sound of the propellers reverberating through the plane, the squad leader was sure his movements were undetectable. He pointed the gun at the seat in front of him and curled his finger around the trigger. The airport grounds raced by. As the front wheels lifted off the black tarmac and the plane tilted back, the squad leader's finger began to squeeze the trigger. Flat Top reacted instantly, pressing the lever in the armrest. He drove all of his body weight backwards with a tremendous heave. The back of the seat reclined, then cracked its hinges and kept going. Before the gun went off, it was knocked from the squad leader's hands, and then Flat Top's full weight was upon him, crushing him from chest to knees like he had fallen into an industrial printing press. Flat Top had heard the gun tumble to the floor, and he needed it now. The remaining 5 soldiers sitting further back were already scrambling for their weapons, and in moments they would open fire. At this range, they couldn't miss. Positioned at the front of the small plane like he was, it would be like shooting very large fish in a very small barrel. Flat Top's fingers closed around cold steel, and he picked up the gun. No telling how many bullets were in the clip, but there had to be at least one, because the squad leader had not fired a shot. That meant at least one of these soldiers would not be going home tonight. There was an explosion of gunfire from all sides as everybody opened fire at the same time. For a couple of seconds, the aeroplane's propellers were completely silenced. In the heat of the moment, Flat Top didn't see or think anything. Years of training meant that he aimed and fired at the enemy almost subconsciously. 1, 2, 3 black-clad soldiers went down. His finger continued to squeeze the trigger long after the chamber was empty. By the time the rear wheels of the plane left the ground, the last shot had been fired, and all 5 soldiers were dead, lying sprawled on the floor or in their seats. Flattop stood up slowly and looked around. 2 windows had been broken and the fuselage had been punctured in dozens of places. The cabin was filled with a howling wind that tore at his clothes. He turned to see if the door leading to the cockpit was still closed, and stumbled. Grabbing hold of a seat, he steadied himself. It was unlike him to lose his balance. Of the 3 GXs, he was arguably the most agile. In fact, he was happiest clinging to the side of a mountain. It was then that he looked down at his own chest. There he saw several dark splotches appearing on his jacket. His own blood. His legs had been relatively untouched by the hail of gunfire. But his upper body had been exposed, and the soldiers' automatic weapons had raked across the width of the cabin, filling the air with lead. There was some pain, but mostly there was a lightheadedness coming over him that he couldn't shake. That was a problem because he still had a mission to complete, one more thing to do before his time was up. He needed to destroy this plane. It hurt to breathe a little bit. Slowly, he moved across to the nearest soldier. The plane was still climbing, so he was walking down the aisle to do that. There were 3 grenades in the pockets of the man's combat vest. He removed them one at a time, being careful not to fumble them. His hands felt numb and cold, a bit uncoordinated. So did his legs, and his vision was starting to go blurry. A couple more minutes and he might not be able to continue. He needed to hurry. Holding the grenades in one hand, he picked up a submachine gun and dragged his feet back up the aisle towards the cockpit door. The 2 men in there were keeping a low profile, but that wasn't going to save them. He tugged on the handle, locked. Raising the machine gun, he blasted the mechanism into pieces, then threw the gun away. Inside the cockpit, there was a brief bout of yelling as the pilots argued about what to do. From the sounds of things, the pilot was ordering the co-pilot to leave the cockpit and kill their attacker. Flattop took another breath. It really hurt now, but there weren't many breaths left, so he had to settle for what he could get. Putting one foot against the cockpit door to make sure he wasn't disturbed, he pulled out each of the grenade pins and stared at the live grenades rocking back and forth in his palm, like Chinese worry balls. Then he wrenched open the door, tossed the grenades inside the cockpit, and slammed the door shut and jammed his foot against it. He had a fleeting image of the co-pilot standing in the doorway with a look of surprise on his face, and the grenades bouncing around on the consoles like big black ball bearings. A moment of silence, some mad thumping of fists against the door, and then, kaboom! The force of the explosion blasted the door off its hinges. Flattop was blown back down the aisle, where he landed on the ground next to the seat he had been sitting in. Winded, he coughed up blood. He tried to sit up but found that he didn't have the strength. Black smoke plumed from the open doorway. Raising his head, he saw the 2 pilots lying dead on the cockpit floor. The interior was on fire and the windscreen was cracked. With nobody at the controls, the plane stopped descending and leveled out. A few moments later, it began to slide to the left in an increasingly steep turn that sent it spiraling towards the mountains to the south of the airport. Exhausted, Flattop put his head back and closed his eyes. He would miss his brothers, but he felt a deep sense of satisfaction that his final mission, the one that really mattered, the one that Mohawk and Maine were depending on him for, had been successfully completed. It was just a shame that he had to spend his last moments alone and inside this claustrophobic tin can. "Holy crap!" exclaimed Zaw. The Yeti rescue team and their human companions watched in disbelief as the aeroplane dived into the mountains and disappeared in a huge orange explosion that shook the night. "What happened?" asked Grint. Shawkat had a knowing look in his eye. "Flattop," he said simply. Isabelle gasped in shock and looked at Mohawk. The giant GX looked very sad. Isabelle wasn't sure what to say. From her point of view, Flattop had been the epitome of evil, but Mohawk had seen the good in him. "I'm sorry," she said. Mohawk nodded. "It's okay," he replied quietly. "I think he found his peace in the end." Laheeti's gaze was fixed on the orange fireball in the distance. "Nothing could have survived that explosion," he said. "No way," agreed Pemba. "That looks like a nuke went off." "The whole mountain's on fire. There's nobody living up there, right?" Laheeti asked. "Not as far as I know," answered Pemba. "The plane must have had a full load of aviation fuel," said Simbara. "That's gonna burn real hot for a while. Should be enough to turn Sierra's body into ashes." "I reckon so," Shawkat said, listening to the wail of sirens approach the airport, "and seeing as the authorities are here, I don't think we should hang around any longer." He started striding towards the gully where the claws were concealed, about 50 meters or so from their present position. The other yetis followed and then the humans, but Mohawk stayed where he was. Isabelle took half a dozen steps, then noticed that the giant GX wasn't beside her. She turned around and saw him standing alone in the dark. "What are you doing?" she asked. "This is as far as I go with you guys," Mohawk stated. She frowned. "What are you talking about?" she asked. "We've got to get out of here. Listen to the sirens. The police will arrive at any minute." The yetis had stopped and were watching the exchange in stony silence. Mohawk looked at Isabelle and understood why she was confused. After all, he had risked his life to help the yetis rescue her and Abby from the North Koreans, so it stood to reason that the yetis should be grateful to him. It was plainly obvious that his heart was in the right place. He was someone they could trust, one of them, but in reality, the situation was more complicated than that. Mohawk understood that in the Yeti's eyes, he and Maine were partly to blame for the whole fiasco. If they had come clean about their true identities when they were brought to Shangri-La, none of this would have happened. They had helped to make things right, but their inclusion in the Yeti rescue team was strictly short-term. Now that the mission was finished, the arrangement was at an end. Mohawk looked at Shawkat. The big Yeti's face was expressionless. The GX nodded and Shawkat nodded once in reply. Cool, tight, distant, Mohawk got the message. He had no friends here. Isabelle's frown deepened. "You're coming back to Shangri-La with us, right?" she asked. Mohawk shook his head. "They're not going to roll out the welcome mat for me in Maine after everything that has happened," he replied. "But that was Flat Top's fault," said Twigger, "not yours or Maine's." "I'm not sure Shangri-La sees it that way," Mohawk said. Shocked, Isabelle turned to face Shawkat. "Is that true?" she blurted out. The Yeti shrugged and said nothing. "So it is true," she exclaimed. "This isn't right," said Laheeti. "Somebody should explain to Shangri-La that Mohawk and Maine are the good guys." "Pemba, can't you do something?" asked Isabelle. "I would if I could," Pemba said truthfully. "But I don't get to make any of the decisions. Can't you talk to somebody?" Isabelle asked. "Does Shawkat look like he listens to anything I say?" Pemba replied quickly. Isabelle's eyes filled with tears. She ran over to Mohawk. "So this is it?" she asked. "We'll never see you again." Mohawk crouched down and gave the blonde-haired teenager a hug. He was more touched by her concern than he showed. "Thank you for everything, Isabelle," he said gently. "Thank you for helping me find my humanity." She wiped the tears off her cheeks. "Thanks for saving us from the landslide on the way to Shabrbesi, and for saving me from the North Koreans," she sobbed. Laheeti and Twig came over. "Where will you and Maine go?" asked the prince. Mohawk shrugged and said, "Nepal's a pretty big place. I guess we'll just move around and see what we can see. After that, well, there's China to the north and India to the south. We'll probably pick one and try our luck there." "So you'll just wander from place to place?" asked Isabelle. For a girl from a stable home in London, it sounded like such an empty existence. "It's kind of what I want," Mohawk said. "The freedom to choose where to live my life and how to live it. Maine too." The GX stood up. Isabelle heard the Yetis encouraging her and the boys to hurry. Stepping away, she said, "Good luck, Mohawk, and say thanks to Maine for me." "I'll miss you both." Then she joined hands with Twig and Laheeti and they ran after the Yetis in the darkness. When they arrived at the gully, the pilots had removed the camouflage covering from the claws and were in the process of hefting their flying machines onto their backs and tightening the harness straps. As Sierra was no longer with them, Zaw, who had arrived at the airport as a passenger, received a pre-flight promotion to the rank of pilot. Vander gave him a crash course in how to fly the machine. Zaw listened attentively, grinning from ear to ear. When the lesson was finished, he buckled himself in as Vander held the claw steady. "Geez, it's heavy," exclaimed Zaw. "Just don't topple backwards and you'll be fine," Vander grunted. "Do you reckon you can manage that?" "Maybe," the teenage Yeti wheezed. It was a good thing nobody had to fly with Zaw because nobody wanted to. Shawkat explained that Abby and Isabelle would take the passenger positions vacated by Mohawk and Maine. That meant Abby was flying with Vander and Isabelle with Shawkat. The teenage girls helped one another into their flying harnesses as Zana watched, giving occasional instructions about which strap went where. Isabelle looked at the claws skeptically. After surviving the attempted abduction by the North Koreans, she had no desire to die in an experimental flying machine. "Are you sure this thing will get us back to Shangri-La?" she asked dubiously. "It got me and Maine here," Shawkat replied, "and I'm fairly sure he weighs a lot more than you do." "Oh, you're only fairly sure?" Isabelle asked grumpily, as she allowed him to pick her up and lock her into place on his harness. "All right," chuckled the Yeti, "I'm very sure." All of the other passengers were bolted into tandem position with their pilots. They powered up their machines, then ran through a quick pre-flight check to ensure the rotors were vectoring properly. Satisfied, they all gave Shawkat the thumbs up and waited for his lead. Shawkat nodded, then increased the power in his own claw and shot into the sky. The others followed. Zaw tentatively thumbed up the throttle, felt the harness straps tightened as they took his weight, then stepped lightly into the air. There he hovered somewhat unsteadily, slowly turning clockwise. When he had control of the machine, he increased power and zoomed after his companions. The cold night air put a rosy glow on Isabelle's cheeks. She stared down at the landscape beneath her as she flew higher into the sky. The airport grounds looked like a black hole in the middle of the maze of lighted streets in Kathmandu. She looked carefully, trying to see Mohawk and Mane somewhere down there in the field, and she thought she saw them, two pale silver motes running together towards the edge of the darkness.
That is the end of this chapter. To listen to the next chapter on YouTube or to purchase the digital ebook from Amazon, see the links in the description.